Hello everyone, my name is Jiayi Chen, and I am a PhD student in Georgia Tech. I am co-advised by Professor Atif Khan in ECE and Professor Mark Losego in Material Science. Today I'm going to present our understanding of the process for ALD of ferroelectric barium titanate thin films. The outline of my presentation is that first, I'm going to talk about the motivation for using ferroelectric materials in microelectronics memory. Then I'm going to talk about our experimental methods, and then I'm going to go through the results, which include optimizing barium and titanium individual precursors, and combining barium and titanium precursors to make barium titanate. And finally, we show the reagent limited diffusion-like crystallization mechanism. So let me say something about the background. So we want to use ferroelectric materials for low voltage memory operation because in the vision for future semiconductors, we want to integrate memory, the top layer with the logic transistors, which are the bottom layers, to reduce interconnects and for better scalability. Ferroelectric field effect transistor, FEFET, is a memory transistor with ferroelectric materials as the gate dielectric and can be integrated well with the process for logic transistors because they are both transistors. Only the gate oxide is changed. But for this vision, and to integrate memory with logic, the memory's operating voltage must be as low as logic's operating voltage so that they can share the same power supply. And currently, the logic's operating voltage is smaller than 0.1 volts. So we want to make this FEFET's memory operating voltage also smaller than 1 volt. Another purpose is that if we follow DRAM's decreasing operating voltage trend, we want to keep reducing the operating voltage when we make DRAM capacitors with ferroelectric materials, so that we have more sustainable operation, and we can minimize the DRAM refreshing voltage to reduce energy use. The goal for my very specific project is that I want to achieve memory operation voltage smaller than 0.1 volts. Because if we look at the graph on the left, as we scale down the thickness, ferroelectric materials coercive field and the coercive voltage are both changing. For the popular hafnium zirconium oxide, the fluoride ferroelectric materials, the coercive voltage is around 1 volt. However, for more classic perovskite ferroelectric materials, the coercive voltage can be as low as 0.1 volts. But these perovskite data points are all made from MBE or PLD deposition methods on selective epitaxy single crystal substrates. So my goal is to make these samples by ALD deposition and make ferroelectric barium titanate thin films. Let me transition now to our experimental method. So our deposition environment is a home-built hot walk flow tube ALD reactor. So the deposition chamber is a long tube, and the door is on this side, on the right side, and the precursors flow from the left side to the door side to the right side. The precursors that we are using is barium isopropyl cyclopentadiol and the titanium isopropyl. Here are the chemical structures, and we are using water as the oxidant, and the deposition temperature is selected to be 290 degrees C. So let we transition to the results, and first we study the precursors individually. The first thing that we do was to identify the barium phase by XPS. So we run this simple experiment. We take a silicon wafer and we run this simple recipe of that we dose barium and purge, and dose water and then purge, and we hope to get barium oxide. And I take this sample to do XPS to see what I get. And here is the XPS of this as deposited sample. So if we look at this as grown oxygen 1s spectrum, the blue curve is the envelope, and clearly it can be deconvoluted into the red curve and the black curve. So there are two chemical states in oxygen. And after some literature research, I find that the red curve is hydroxide and the black curve is carbonate, and there is no oxide peak. Then I look at the carbon 1s spectrum, and again I see two peaks. The peak with lower binding energy is a carbon-carbon residual carbon peak, and the peak with higher binding energy is belongs to carbonate. So after this XPS, I conclude that we are not actually getting barium oxide. Instead, we are getting barium hydroxide and barium carbonate. So the hypothesis is that in the reaction chamber, I was actually depositing barium hydroxide. But as I take the sample across the campus and do XPS, it is exposed to air. And during this exposure time, the sample becomes a mixture of barium hydroxide and barium carbonate. So to confirm our hypothesis, we designed this following experiment. So again, we take this the sample that is exposed to air, and I continue exposing it to air for several days and see what happens. So I did this, and again, I take the XPS, and this time I only see one peak in the oxygen 1s spectrum, and that is only carbonate and no hydroxide. And when I look at the carbon 1s spectrum, I still see the carbonate peak and the carbon-carbon residual peak. So it turns out that after exposing this sample to air for enough time, it becomes barium carbonate completely. So we conclude that the reaction is complete after enough exposing to air, and the barium hydroxide becomes barium carbonate completely. And we also did some experiments to confirm the in situ phase structure. So basically, we take the silicon wafer and run the barium deposition, and we in situ cap the barium hydroxide film with aluminum oxide. And when we take this sample to do XPS, we in situ etch this aluminum oxide layer away inside XPS. And this time, we also only see one peak in oxygen spectrum, but this time it is hydroxide, not carbonate. And when we look at the carbon spectrum, there is no carbon signal. So a carbonate is impossible. So we conclude that a capping aluminum oxide prevents the reaction between barium hydroxide and the CO2 in air. And we are actually depositing barium hydroxide in the reactor, not barium carbonate. Yeah, and after having some understanding about barium, we switched to titanium oxide. So although ALD TiO2 by titanium isoproposite is very well studied, we still want to confirm that titanium isoproposite doesn't decompose at this 290 degrees C, this high temperature. So we prepared TiO2 thin film at several thicknesses, and we see that the deposition is quite linear, and this deposition rate 0.4 angstrom per cycle also makes sense, which is at the higher end of reported values. And we take the grazing incidence XRD of ALD TiO2, the sample that we made, and we see that we are actually getting annotated TiO2 according to the XRD. Then we combine these two precursors together. So we already see that the barium forms barium hydroxide and can easily deteriorate to barium carbonate when it is exposed to air. And so the question is, how well do barium hydroxide and barium carbonate react with TiO2 to form barium titanate? So we designed an experiment like this. We first take a silicon wafer and deposit a layer of aluminum oxide and the barium, and then a layer of barium hydroxide on top. So this aluminum oxide is necessary because we want to separate the barium with silicon. Otherwise, the barium will react with silicon to form barium silicate when we anneal the structure. After this structure, we continue our deposition and in situ continue to deposit a layer of titanium oxide. Or we can take this structure out of the reactor and expose it to air for several days, just like what we did in the previous 3 slides. And after several days, it will completely become barium carbonate. And then we continue our deposition and cap a layer of titanium oxide on top. Then we anneal these two structures at 700 C for 2 hours. And let's see the difference between these two structures. And thus we can compare the reactivity of barium hydroxide and barium carbonate. So for the structure with barium hydroxide, here is the XRD before and after annealing. So in the as-grown structures, we clearly see a very clear peak of TiO2 and 2 small peaks which belong to the barium hydroxide. And after annealing, the 2 barium hydroxide peaks are gone. Instead, we have a barium titanate peak at 31.5 degrees, and there is still a lot of TiO2. And for the barium carbonate structure, so we do the same thing, like we take the as-grown sample XRD and we take the XRD after annealing, but this time we don't see anything happening. Like there is no BTO formation that we expect. Then we either extend the annealing time or increase the annealing temperature. So then we start to see some BTO formation and barium hydroxide formation at 800 degrees C. So we conclude that the annotate TiO2 reaction with barium hydroxide is more favorable, and the reaction with carbonate is thermodynamically less favorable. So, and another question is that we already know that the barium, there has to be a separation layer between the barium and silicon. So previously we used the aluminum oxide. So can we use another material as the barrier layer? Does this material matter? So we designed this experiment again. So we take silicon wafer and we deposit either aluminum oxide or TiO2 at bottom. And then we run the same number of cycles of barium on top. Yeah, so although we ran the same number of cycles, but we still get slightly different thicknesses. And then we kept the structure with opposite materials. And we find that TiO2 at bottom facilitates the crystallization. So we have these two structures that we made in the previous slide. And we take the XRD before and after annealing. So clearly we see that so after annealing, we clearly see that the structure with TiO2 has stronger barium tightening signal, which means more crystalline barium titanate. So we conclude that TiO2 at bottom is better, probably because the as-grown TiO2 is crystalline, and it offers a template effect for barium titanate crystallization. But if we look at this XRD, we find that there is still a huge TiO2 peak remaining after annealing. So it seems like the reaction is incomplete. And why is that? So maybe the reaction hasn't been given enough time, or are we fully consuming one of the reactants? Like we are consuming titanium oxide or barium hydroxide. So to verify our first hypothesis, the time hypothesis, we designed this time sequence that we take this structure and we anneal it at different times, 1 minute, 5 minutes, and 2 hours. And we see that the reaction is already almost complete after 5 minutes, because there is almost no difference between 5 minutes and 2 hours. So we think it is other reason, like it's the reactant ratio reason. And we change the reactant ratio by layer thickness. So basically we keep the thickness of barium hydroxide the same, and we decrease the TiO2 thickness from 15 to 10 and to 5 in these three structures. And we take the XRD of as-grown sample and the annealed sample. So in this 15 nanometer TiO2 sample, we already see that there is still a lot of TiO2 remaining after annealing. And in this 10 nanometer TiO2 sample, we see that there is like the TiO2 doesn't show up after annealing. And in this 5 nanometer TiO2 sample, we see that there is a small amount of barium hydroxide remaining after annealing. And we also see that the reaction kinetics became a lot slower because the reaction is still not complete after 5 minutes. On the other hand, the other two structures reactions are already complete after 5 minutes. So we think that this the middle one is the perfect ratio. So to conclude, in this study, we studied we found that this barium isopropyl cyclopentadiol precursor and water produces barium hydroxide at 290 degrees C, and this barium hydroxide is susceptible to carbonate formation when it is exposed to atmosphere. And we find this conclusion mainly by XPS. And we find that barium hydroxide reacts readily, like is thermodynamically more favorable with TiO2 to form barium titanate. And the reaction of TiO2 with carbonate is slower. And we find that there has to be a separation layer between the barium and titanium, between the barium and silicon. And if we choose this TiO2 as the bottom layer, it facilitates crystallization than aluminum oxide. And finally, we review the reagent limited diffusion crystallization mechanism in these nanolaminate structures. That's it for the presentation. Thank you.